Hello and welcome to our first Coriolis Technologies multilateral working lunch. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce the panel today, Roberto Leva from ADB, Gwynne Masters from Lloyds and Surath Sengupta from HSBC. Absolute delight to be talking about something that's so close to our hearts at the moment. As a vaccine looks like it's coming onto the market for COVID-19. Roberto, I wonder if you would want to talk us through what ADB has been doing in this space to bring together the whole financial services sector and agencies around promoting tools to fight the pandemic.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. So, well, everyone, we all are currently living in very awkward situation. Like I'm supposedly living in Manila, but in reality, I'm in Italy since April. And I know there are plenty of other people in my same situation, kind of moving around, trying to live their normal life, but trying to little bit moving ahead and trying to fix the situation with the COVID-19 the best we can. Now, ADB back in February, I would say, when it was clear that there was a little bit of a challenge in understanding what was going on with the personal protection equipment supply chains, for example. There was a big news back at the beginning of the year. You know, masks couldn't be found anywhere in certain countries, oxygen, so on and so forth. What we did was simply try to ask the banks we work with about where the production of these goods were located, how to bring financing to these producers, and so on and so forth. Well, reality is that like there was a little bit of uncertainty of who were actually the companies involved in these very important supply chains. And so we decided to start an exercise of mapping these very important supply chains of items that we know would have been vital for the fight to COVID-19. So back in at the beginning of March, we started reaching out to partners, Coriolis being one of those, and we decided to start an exercise that was, to my knowledge, not tried before, and specifically not in this type of circumstances, about mapping supply chain worldwide of the core products. Now, we started with the basic products of PPE were some masks, we had some medical equipment, ventilators were very high in the agenda of many companies. They couldn't find, hospitals were running out of this type of vital equipment. And then we started growing organically this tool. Now, I assume you're all able to see the tool on the screen. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about what this tool is about. Now, as first step, I think we created a little video that we wanted to share with everyone, which kind of gives an introduction to the tool. And then I'll run to a quick demo before we start this conversation. Okay, so give me just a second. Here we go. So I'm gonna play the video now. It's gonna last 2.5 minutes just to give you a little bit of background.
You've seen shortages, you've seen blockages in the supply of critical goods. You know, we can see that no one country can, you know, have all of the component parts and materials that are needed to supply themselves with everything that's needed to fight this terrible crisis. And so we need strong and robust global supply chains to help us deal with this very global problem. even in a post-COVID world, I hope we can apply this sort of thinking around supply chains, how important it is to have strong, robust, resilient supply chains that can deliver food and medicines and vital goods and around the world where they're needed most. So, you know, I'd like to think that this tool is going to be part and parcel of you know, what will help us achieve, you know, stronger, more robust supply chains.
Perfect. So the gentleman you saw speaking is my manager. So he runs the trade and supply chain finance program at Asian Development Bank. As Stephen was saying in the video, as I was briefly introducing, so what we have been trying to do is to keep this tool as simple as possible. So the idea is for you, and when I say you, first of all, we've got 3 U's in mind. We've got banks that need to look at this tool to find out where the money should be going for us to be able to leave our homes, possibly as soon as possible. The second U would be the corporates, the people that are actually involved in the production to find out which additional producers would be there, and like in the, for example, for the raw materials or potential clients to kind of bring these goods where they need to be. And the third U is governments or any official organization that is out there to try and find out and managing the stocks, for example, in hospitals for different countries, to try and understand where the resource can come from. Now, if you can follow a little bit me on the tool, like basically the tool is very simple. We got the mapping by product where you'll be able to find, for example, medical equipment, and you go and look at the ventilator here. And when you look at ventilator, you're able to find the final products and all the producers across the world of these ventilators that we identified. And then you can go up in the supply chain by the components that make up of a ventilator. There was a lot of new knowledge that came in from us as well. We had to work with obviously health experts to get this one right. The raw materials that go into the components, and then depending on the product, you can also be able to view the processing. If we also know which machines are used to build this product, we have that, for example, for the masks. And distributions that we are now focusing on when it comes to like logistics, warehousing, and distribution channels. Now, this before we move on to the other speakers, like this tool is growing, right? So it was very basic when it started, and it's not 100% done yet. When I say it's not 100% done, doesn't mean that what you find now in the tool is incorrect. It's correct. What we're trying to do is kind of grow it even more. So like, for example, we can also view the production distribution across the globe in terms of if you're focused on a specific country. And where we are trying to grow now is specifically through area, the vaccines, which is very important. We have a lot of news coming up of new vaccines, but how do we get them? How do we get them produced? And how do we physically get them where they need to be? So we're creating with Coriolis the heat map of the vaccine that should be released in the next month. And we're also looking specifically at cold chains. So those of you that might have read, some of the vaccine being produced, it needs to be distributed in very specific vehicle and held in very specific temperature. So we are also working with international organizations to try and identify how the cold chain can work across the world to ensure that the vaccine gets where it needs to get with still active and be able to be distributed. So sorry, I had to kind of summarize 7-8 months of work that Rebecca and I have been doing together with the team in less than 10 minutes. I hope it was valuable. Now maybe I can pass on the ball to Gwynne so she can give us a little bit of the impression that the bank have about this tool, because ultimately, as I said, banks are one of the users that want to attract.
Sure. I'm happy to jump in. Thanks, Roberto. I mean, I think the tool is quite impressive, and let's face it, we're facing into the supply chain mission of the century right now, in terms of COVID, and you know, I think if we were to look at this as a fancy meal, you know, maybe the PPE equipment was the canapé or the amuse-bouche. And the vaccine is probably our appetizer, and climate change is our main course. you know, if you think about what's in front of us in terms of the vaccine, the news is very positive, but how do we vaccinate a population, a world population of 7.8 billion? It's going to be something, and the ADB tool speaks to that challenge. I tried to get my head around what is 7.8 billion, and you know, what does it really mean? You had a picture up there of a syringe and some rubber gloves and some masks. You know, what does vaccinating, what does that look like in terms of sustainability? And where do we put all that stuff? 7.8 billion seconds ago, it was 1789. That gives you a sense of what we're talking about in terms of quantity of syringes and vials and rubber gloves and transport. And that's, you know, only if we need to get one vaccination, and we might need two. So I think, you know, looking at this tool, Roberto, I think, you know, it's a marvelous mapping tool. It's proved to be really strong for us as an entry point for discussion with our clients when they look at their supply chains, the disruption challenges that they've had, building resilience, diversifying their supply chain, improving costs, enhancing quality. For us, it was really effective in terms of supporting clients through the pandemic as well. You know, more businesses sought to identify additional manufacturers of PPE equipment to meet their extreme demands. And certainly the ADB tool for me, it goes way beyond PPE. You know, you've already taken it from 7 to 25 products. And when we sit back and take a look at it, the tool itself can be used for any product and all components that make up that product. I don't want to take up too much time, but happy to speak in a lot more detail around the topic.
So maybe we could bring in Andrew, or maybe bring in Sarath first, and then we'll bring in Andrew to talk about the institutional aspects of all of this. But Sarath, if you'd like to talk about how HSBC is involved with all of this as well, because obviously this is a huge collaborative effort, and the key thing is getting as many agencies as possible and banks as possible to use the tool and understand how it can be used in the commercial setting. So maybe you'd like to tell us what you've been doing with it.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. I think to sort of echo Gwynne, I think we started off seeing this as the challenge of it when governments started speaking to us about how much of an issue this was, when they really wanted to speak to us about connecting governments with legitimate PPE suppliers across the world. You know, we are a global bank, so they were naturally looking at us if we can help them connect them with legitimate PPE suppliers. So suddenly when this whole pandemic hit, people were kind of caught on the wrong foot. They didn't know where to source things from, how they can source, etc. And while we were connecting, we sort of spoke with ADB, we spoke with you, Rebecca, etc. And in this sort of this development of this tool definitely helped in terms of making sure that the money and the funding reaches where it needs to reach, the working capital requirement for those SMEs in an agile manner, that it reaches there, which was very, very important at that stage. But as Gwynne sort of also mentioned, this is probably just the beginning, right? So if PPE was a challenge, I mean, the enormity of the scale of challenge of vaccines is probably, something that we can't even fathom today. And the way I look at it, it's whatever 5.5, 8 billion, 11 billion doses. I mean, the numbers just are staggering. I mean, if you look at both the manufacturing side, where you have sort of a Chilean soap bark which is required, so which comes from a particular tree in Chile, to Sweden producing vials. Just the challenge of that was, and on the distribution side, IATA estimates that there are 8,000 747s required to transport vaccines. The equivalent of 8,000 747s, right? So just the scale, it's just to give a perspective of what the scale of the issue is. And in this whole thing, in this whole ecosystem, we cannot have a single point of failure. So if one point fails, the whole thing comes down drastically, right? So we have to make sure that this whole thing happens in as seamless a manner as possible. So we have, to an extent, tackled the PPE problem, but we have to massively tackle the vaccination issue, and there is no sort of shortcut to it. And this tool is one of the natural allies in that journey. And if I look at the third step, which again I like the way sort of Gwynne put it, is climate, right? I mean, even if we are able to tackle COVID, which is far from over, and that will take probably years to get across this hurdle, but climate is probably a big challenge that is looming, and 80% of companies' carbon footprint is in their supply chains. So how do we tackle that? So I'll stop there. I think the challenge is mind-boggling, and this is a great ally in this whole journey.
So mind-boggling challenge, Andrew. Earlier on today, we heard John Denton talk about how business and finance and governments need to work with each other. Absolutely, how this whole effort has to be collaborative in order to make sure that we actually do something and do it properly and make it sustainable in every sense of the word. And you know, Sarath and Gwynne have both made it absolutely clear sustainability has to be part of this equation. Chucking that number of jumbo jets up into the air to move stuff around isn't particularly sustainable. So we're going to have to think of ways of managing all of this. What is the international community doing? What's happening at an ICC and United Nations level to help with all of this?
Good question, Rebecca. Well, I think Roberto said it wonderfully earlier, that we're very much in uncharted territory, and I think there are two factors that really sort of stand out from the work we've been doing with businesses, large and small, throughout our network, but also with multilateral institutions, particularly the UN. The first is the lack of, if you like, visibility or transparency in terms of what's happening in the real economy. And at the start, that was very much defined by issues in terms of understanding the spread of the virus. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is a lack of understanding around supply chains, particularly on the vaccine side, but also more broadly, and also the actual needs of the real economy, of businesses. So we see a real disconnect between the data we see from our network on the performance of small businesses in particular, and the figures or the modeling that we see the IMF using, for instance. And then the second issue, I think, has been a lack of international cooperation in one sense, but also I think, and I really think this comes out from the G20's latest communique, genuine complacency around what is needed to bring the virus to a close, or the pandemic to a close, and really to safeguard the economy. And I think on those 2 points, but first of all, let's just say if there's anything we can do through our global network to support the ADB's work in terms of bringing greater visibility to the vaccine supply chain, then you can count on our full and active support. But really, we see two primary priorities looking forward. The first is to avoid the potential chaos that will be caused by vaccine nationalism. So countries turning inwards to safeguard supply of vaccines. And in a complex international supply chain, that clearly brings a number of risks to supply. But we've also been very, very clear, and I think this is a message we'll continue to reinforce in the coming months with a number of new studies, that the only way to safeguard the global economy is to ensure that there is equitable sharing of supply of vaccine doses throughout the world. It's one thing to inoculate the United States, but what about the markets that have become very important from an export perspective and also from a supply perspective into the US economy? So that's one issue that we think still is a major downside risk in terms of bringing the pandemic to a close, and one where we actually need to build much greater understanding, particularly within the G20, about the economic payoff of ensuring equitable sharing. And the G20 made positive noises on this at the weekend, which is good. But the real proof point comes with whether G20 nations choose to capitalize the WHO's access to COVID tools accelerator facility, and do they choose to do so very rapidly? The second issue we see, and I think this speaks to the supply chain, but it speaks more broadly, I think, to the economic situation faced by SMEs, is access to finance. So we're seeing SMEs through with extremely weak balance sheet positions, levels of debt that we wouldn't even normally see during relatively deep recessions. So unpaid invoices trending at 200, 300% their normal rates. And a real risk that supply of commercial finance may very naturally retrench in response to those commercial conditions. So we think we need to see from the G20 in particular, and the Deputy Director General of the WTO spoke very eloquently about this, I think, yesterday at the G20. We need to see much greater emphasis on safeguarding the supply of commercial credit, particularly working capital, but also trade finance. And that will be critical not only for the supply of any future effective vaccines, but also critical for the viability of SMEs. And the big downside risk that we really see looking into 2021 is the risk of small business failures. When we survey SMEs within our network, particularly in emerging markets, most put a 3 to 6 month timeframe on their viability without additional government support or without a return to pre-pandemic levels of demand. So we're clearly entering a really critical moment for the global economy, where we need interventions to provide equitable sharing of vaccines, but also real concerted, coordinated interventions from the G20 to safeguard access to commercial credit. Let's hope the G20 gets that right.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, there's an awful lot there. So, Roberto, this was all about enabling finance, wasn't it? So this was about making sure that SMEs were able to access finance, that the whole supply chain was kept moving, because you understood right at the very beginning that the whole issue was that people didn't know where the supply chains were and where the money needed to get to and where the connections needed to get to in the first instance.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's one of the reason we kept this. So a lot of institutions we contacted from an ADB perspective, they were saying, oh, then you looked at the countries that your development member countries, and I'm like, no, we looked at the whole world, and everyone was asking why. That's outside of scope. I was like, well, have a look. You can't really just, I mean, you might physically live in an island, but that doesn't work in this type of discussions. And that wasn't a reference to the UK or anyone in particular, but the point is,
we don't take
like,
it personally, we're used to it, right? We're getting very used to this.
But the point is, like, in general, like, to make this study valuable, you need to look at it holistically, and you need to understand that we are all in this together, pretty much literally, because if you look at the data that, well, your team have been analyzing with us, you can see how things are interconnected very, very deeply. Now, what we want out of this study is, for example, to ensure that, the banks can start using the data that we provided. Now, we went through several iterations of data cleansing data. It's not easy to build this, you know better than I do, but the level of data that we provide now can be literally taken by a bank, compare with their client list, and then they need to pick up the phone. Now, obviously, like, the way we tailor this study is, like, it can be used by a global bank or by a regional bank or by a domestic bank, and they can literally target also the size of the clients. Now, what we've been trying to do is trying to share as much information as possibly could, but within the limitation that obviously we can't give you an ocean of information, otherwise you wouldn't know what to do with it. So we had to pick certain fields. We make it downloadable, we make it as clean as possible, but then there is also a level of the underlying user to understand and take that data and bring it to a level of comparing with their client bases, or potentially create a list of a target clients that they just need to pick up the phone and go and work with. So ADB is there to collaborate in certain areas. Obviously, we are directly present, so we can, like, financially collaborate. In other area, we're just sharing data about information, but we are not taking anything of this as proprietary. It's out there, like what I've shown. Like, literally anyone can go on the website, public, get the information and evaluate. And there are also some contact information if anyone wants to speak. But the point is that we've been trying to be as much of a good corporate citizens that we possibly could. Is the tool perfect? Not yet. As I said, it's been grown by iteration, but also we've been receiving feedback. So user feedback is actually very much encouraged. We have even a little thing about questions or feedback on the tool, because that's what we want to build. Doesn't need to look pretty per se, it needs to be useful. That's how you get this problem solved. We made it look pretty because it's nicer, but the point is like it needs to be really useful. So if someone has feedback, we can take it on. Gwen was mentioning as well throughout here about sustainability. It's a very important element. It's not embedded in the tool yet. It's one of the things we might be growing with. Then, you know, at the moment, the banks can do their own cross-checking. We are evaluating that ourselves. Again, we have to grow things into phases. The next one is, as we are having discussion with the distributors of the vaccine, both those that have to manage the inoculation of the vaccine, and to those that literally have to transport it. And we're trying to include that data into the heat map I mentioned we are building before. So there is more to come specifically for the vaccine. What for example, what Andrew was mentioning of the International Chamber of Commerce, it's very good that this organization keep us in the loop of discussions and bring up our tool, because it could be very helpful for a lot of international organizations. Like my background is banking, and in ADB though, the beauty of it is that we've got people with background in health services, for example. So we have been speaking with the WHO, we have been speaking with UNICEF, we have been speaking for development. So it's very interesting, the level of the diversity of players that you have to come into this. Makes it very interesting, but makes it very complex at the same time. So that has been the challenge, and I don't deny that sometimes it can be quite heavy to ensure that everyone is well connected. So ICC and other industry body can play that role of helping us remaining relevant in all the discussions, thousands of discussions happening every day.
It's brilliant, and I guess I would say, Sarath, Gwynne, you're the ones that are actually engaged in delivering to supply chains, so and making all of this sustainable. And it's interesting. What are the challenges that your clients are telling us on the ground? I mean, what are people saying about these supply chains and how they're working and how difficult it is to resource them properly?
Yeah, Gwen, you're on mute. So do you want me to go first?
Go for it.
I'll go. So, okay. Look, I think what the panel that we have today is a microcosm of what is needed to really tackle the challenges in what we are facing today in supply chains, right? Because it requires a massive amount of public and private partnership to really get across the hurdle. And there are multiple challenges. I mean, COVID to an extent has put the spotlight on some of the challenges that already existed. So some of the challenges have got manufactured because of the pandemic, but some of it is the spotlight that it has put on the supply chains, because the resilience of supply chain was already quite weak, because people had skinned it to the bone and made it so efficient to make it just in time that a single breakage was actually creating havoc in the supply chains. And we've seen that during the Japanese nuclear plant challenge that happened, which broke down several supply chains. Yeah. But I think what is happening now is two or three things, right? So there is a huge amount of reconfiguration of supply chains that are taking place because of the pandemic and because of certain other issues like geopolitical tensions that are around the world today, which means that we need to make sure that the funding reaches the right place at the right time. The risk mitigation happens in this very complex supply chain environment in the right manner as well. And the third thing that we are seeing, which is quite interesting, and this is where the COVID has actually accelerated some of the challenges, is around the whole sustainability issue, right? So before COVID, we were speaking and we were seeing good success on this topic of sustainability in supply chains with the large corporates. So we were speaking with some pretty large corporates and we were working in their supply chains to help them make it more carbon efficient. But now, over the last 3-4 months, we are seeing so much more dialogue from our supplier base, because we bank both the buyers and the suppliers. We are seeing so much more inquiries from the supplier base on how to make it more sustainable. I mean, we recently did a survey where 85% of the corporates told us that sustainability and carbon footprint is very important to them as they build back. So we are seeing a lot of ask from our SME and mid-market supplier base, asking us how we can help them make their business sustainable. So I think there are so many key things which are coming across now, which is resilience in supply chains, which is reconfiguration of supply chains, which is building supply chains in a more sustainable manner, that we, from the private side and on the other side, whether it's Andrew and I've had some really good chats around this topic as well. And if you look at Roberto from ADB, Rebecca, yourself, we all need to come together, and this is not a competition. This is about partnership, how we all bring together, because the challenge is massive and we can together help at least alleviate some of it.
Absolutely.
Well, I know that's what you think. I know that's what you think.
I would echo that. I mean, you know, with the ADB and with Coriolis, you know, we've got a tool to drive resilience, but by definition, you know, resilience of supply chain has to include sustainability. And what we've seen across our businesses, you know, there have been a couple of statistics shared today. When they are calculating their carbon footprint, the studies that we've done in the UK, the carbon footprint multiplies 5-fold. It becomes 5 times worse once you incorporate supply chain. And so where you see the opportunity really between, you know, the likes of the fintech and the government agencies and policymakers and banks is really to collaborate around ESG and ESG scoring, so that we can take a look at, you know, what exactly is sitting inside my supply chain and how do I move to improve it. You know, a company's carbon footprint is reportable now in the UK. Our corporates have to report out, and it's not just their building. Just like a bank, it's not the building in which we sit, it's our balance sheet. And, you know, our corporates are expressing the same concerns. Give me sight of what's sitting in my supply chain from a carbon footprint standpoint. And this is where I find it really exciting. We're on the cusp of technology, but we need a common measure. We need a common way to report out on carbon footprint, on that ESG score, which is not only environmental. I mean, Rebecca, you and I have talked about it before. It's also that social and governance component that's so important as well. How do we bring that into the supply chain measures that we're reporting back to our clients? You know, we're very good at reporting the credit risk or the logistics potential disruption within a supply chain. But we need to go a little bit further, and it's going to require a lot of cooperation to bring in that ESG score.
So I think that goes to what Andrew was saying as well. And I really would like the audience to start jumping in as well, because this is a working lunch. So do kind of raise a hand, raise a chat, or just make yourself visible so that we can include you in the conversation, because this is collaborative, and I think this is really important. So the point Gwynne, Sarath, and Roberto are making very, very clearly is that this is about everybody joining together. Andrew, I don't know about you, but I sit on the outside as a data provider analyst, and I think Steve Beck called me a fixture once. So as just a fixture in this space, I didn't take that as a compliment. But it's wonderful, isn't it, to see everybody suddenly talking about collaboration rather than competition. So out of this whole COVID thing, we must bring together the supranational health organisations, the ICC, around inclusivity and sustainability, and actually economic development. So we're beginning to talk about trade and supply chains as an issue in economic development, and maybe that's something positive that's coming out of the crisis. Do you think?
Well, we can only hope, I think. But I think the broader point is true, that we're seeing a shift, which I think is pretty fundamental, in recognizing that collaboration will be vital in terms of, so to speak, building back better. And I think one of the things that almost sort of differentiates the political response versus the real economy response is, I think if you look at what the G20 said over the weekend, yes, people talk about the importance of sustainability. Yes, we need to accelerate digitization. But then when you start to try and unpick what that means, you see actually there's a pretty sizable fundamental challenge ahead of us, and that can only be achieved with real, genuine systems engineering, with or without supportive public policy frameworks. So on the sustainability side, to Sarath's point, we are seeing organic demand from SMEs, quite to our surprise actually, looking to take more ambitious climate action, looking at how they can improve their sustainability footprint. We're also seeing that demand from multinationals as well, but the demand is organic. But then you actually start to unpick, well, what does that mean? How do we get accessible tools into the hands of small businesses? How do we create the right sorts of commercial incentives, whether that's in terms of preferential access to finance, procurement preferences, whatever it might be. But clearly systems need to be engineered in terms of how the real economy functions. And people will need support, or small businesses will need support. And that really has been a fundamental change in how we've operated and how we've conceived of our position within our global network. So for instance, in September, we launched something called the SME Climate Hub, which is really just a platform where SMEs can make a UN recognized net zero pledge. But in doing so, they're then given access to freely available best-in-class tools, and also essentially a marketplace where they can start to derive commercial benefits from being climate leaders or climate pioneers. And it's that type of collaboration, bringing together the UN, the banks, and different players within the global supply chain, that we think will be pivotal in actually moving the world to a more sustainable footing.
I'm sorry, I'm being very rude here because I'm jumping in ahead of the audience, but I know Roberto and Gwynne, this sort of measuring sustainability through that type of almost like some kind of certification is very dear to your heart. So,
yes.
So how do you see that initiative?
So I think I'm happy to jump in first, Roberto, and then over to you. But I think it's quite exciting what we're seeing on the client identifier side. There's a lot of work going on to produce a corporate passport, if you will, down to the smallest of entity that gives them the permission to travel through the financial system. And I think with that kind of an identifier, you know, when we travel from the UK to Indonesia, the Indonesian customs authorities, the border control doesn't reproduce our passport. They have a trust in the identity. Similarly, there are digital identities that are being created. The technology exists. It's really what do you put within that identity, and can an ESG score be
Might have just lost her.
Sorry, we lost you there.
I think she's back.
You went back on mute. Sorry, Gwen, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, apologies. It's a connectivity issue here in the UK. But yeah, no, I think the exciting part is what you can embed within that client identifier. And then it gets down to a globally accepted, simple ESG form of measurement. I'm also really excited about, you know, some of the things that we see coming out of the investment community, the comments coming out of BlackRock, and the impact that that's going to have on capital for ESG leaders. Likewise, the tax system. I think tax might be one of the biggest levers that we have to pull in this world of sustainability. So it gets down to that cooperative community well beyond the client identifier. But, you know, if we can start to tax not only on revenue earned, but how revenue is earned, you know, that's what we're talking about. And companies within the supply chain are talking about how they buy, how they supply. It's becoming far more fundamental. And the interesting thing is that the tools exist. And so it is a matter of sitting down in a room with the right players and pulling it together.
Sarath, do you want to come in on that? Well, there's nobody else jumping around at the moment, so I am. So, Sarath, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So, I mean, I'm the sponsor of sustainability for trade finance in HSBC. So this is very close to my heart, and I think the big, I mean, there are so many obstacles, but there are so many positives that are happening in this space that it is not. I mean, it's really encouraging, right? So if you look at it, some of the biggest challenges though is today most of the financing that banks do, especially big banks do, is on the tier 1 or tier 2 of the supply chain. So our impact today on the carbon footprint is still very limited in terms of what we can influence to up to maybe tier 2, in some cases tier 3. But supply chains exist and go much beyond that. So I think with technology coming in, the transparency that it is bringing with it, I mean, things like blockchain, tokens, etc., will enable us to go much deeper into the supply chain. I mean, right down to the farmer in some instances as well,
Yes.
right? So as we build that transparency and as we build the financing pipes right down to the ends of that supply chain, there is this enormous ability to influence and create something which is far more sustainable than what it is today. And sustainable, and I agree with, I think Gwynne or Roberto, one of you were making this point, it's not just about climate, right? It's about social, it's about governance, and there's a huge social element in these supply chains as well. So that's the whole piece that we are very positively looking at. So yes, there could be some ways of negatively impacting this in using penalties, etc., but there is a huge amount of positive bias that can be brought in to support this whole piece.
Roberto,
I completely agree.
Sorry.
Yeah, I completely echo what Sarath has said.
No, well, obviously, I mean, I cannot disagree. Otherwise, I would be the witch of the conversation. But I am in agreement with that. The point there are two things. So when we look at the tool, for example, this COVID-19, the little video was saying that this is the.
Maybe I'll step in if anybody can hear me. There's a bit of a lag, but I was going to. Yeah, I completely agree with.
Oh, sorry. I think there is a lag in Gwen's conversation. Okay. So now I was just saying that we have the tool has been created now to look at COVID-19 elements. But as the video said, this is the first time we do it, but not the last time. So similar technology could be used also to map sustainable goods, for example, or like those items that have not known challenges in their production to be considered as sustainable. So we can use this level of transparency of mapping also for specific research. Could be logging, could be some sort of agriculture production, all of that. So the technology and the methodology that we are creating with Coriolis from ADB perspective could be used for that. And will be used for that, just give us some time. But at the same time, we need to recognize that, as I said before, this is a global exercise. And today I was talking to a bank in an emerging market about improving their environmental and social standards. And one of the questions that I was asked is like, why should I do it? So like, you know, it's also kind of like ensuring that the regulatory requirements across the globe are kind of like synced. I know I'm talking about like, you know, it's a very high demand, but the point is like, that's what it comes down to. So like additional controls, additional level of transparency do work, but at the same time, you need to make it worth it for those that have to invest into these elements for them to do it. I'm not saying about penalties, but you know, it's maybe tax breaks or something like that. Again, it's very hard to define this on a global basis, but unfortunately, as we see, whatever you end up, maybe this pen was made somewhere on the other side of the world and God knows by whom. So you need to be realistic in the fact that if you want to implement these standards, you need to aim for the sky.
I think
Yeah,
what's interesting.
I think that's.
Sorry.
I was going to say, you know, it's really spot on, isn't it? It's going to impact the cost of capital. it's going to impact tax, it's going to impact demand. You know, if we just talk about the syringe that we saw at the very beginning of this session, you know, who's producing it and how is it being produced? And, you know, if you can put an ESG score around that, it's going to impact demand for products. And that's where I see things going. You know, the buyers of the supplies are going to make some decisions, because those decisions are going to impact their own carbon footprint and the report out that they have to their own regulators.
And in the end, this is a bit of a stick and a carrot, and finding out which metrics work and which ones don't. I mean, I have to throw in here, I'm an economist, and so one mantra that always works in economics is if you start to measure something, it ceases to be useful. I mean, I think we have to throw that in. But I guess my question of not just you guys, but also of the audience, because I can see from the list there's a huge amount of expertise here, is where should we be looking next? I mean, we need to move this COVID-19 crisis into something long-term and from this into something long-term and sustainable. But there are immediate challenges around the COVID-19 supply chain, and you've only got to open a newspaper and you will see nose clips and elastic bands around face masks washing up on beaches and so on. And is there something that we can do immediately with measuring the sustainability? Is there something immediately that companies should be reporting? Maybe they should be listed on Andrew's SME Hub, Sustainability Hub. Is there some kind of connection that specifically with this tool we can actually start to introduce these things quite quickly? Because that has to be, connecting the two has to, and moving gradually towards something more sustainable has to be the way forward, doesn't it? So of the audience as well as of the panel, I guess. The audience is silent.
Maybe I just put in a couple of sort of things that we need to think about as we go towards a society which is more focused on sustainability, and we are clearly seeing that's the demand from consumers, from our customers, etc. So two things that I think, one of them is how do we incentivize banks with the right sort of capital treatment around sustainable trade finance. It's not an easy subject. I know there are a lot of nuances to it in terms of reflecting the appropriate risk, etc. But it is clearly one of the themes that got picked up this year by the B20 in support of their recommendations to G20. But how do we make sure that that is the case? And the second one is exactly what we are talking about. You have used data, which is the first step towards standardization, because the moment you have data, moment you have full transparency, you create standardization, and from standardization the next step is automation and then digitization. So you've created the first step in terms of creating a supply chain ecosystem, transparency in that ecosystem, which is far more digitizable, if I may use that word. So I almost broke my mouth saying that, but yeah, I think that's I think what is going to be a big value in how we take this thing forward in digitizing supply chains much more as well.
Cool. I can see that Jeff Ando has a question that he wants to jump in with.
Yeah, I've got a very UK-centric question, so apologies for that, which is the thoughts around supply chains. I guess there's a lot of positive developments in the vaccine that we've been hearing, or various vaccines we've been hearing about, and some of them are manufactured in mainland Europe. So bearing in mind from December the 31st, we're talking about a massive backlog of lorries coming into Dover and some materials that are very sensitive, cold chain storage, etc. Are we looking at this being the next logistical supply chain calamity, which feels like we've had various throughout this year? And where do you see the sort of solutions around that, or the major problems?
Speaking from the UK, right? I don't have a crystal ball on December 31st and what January 1st will look at but I mean, certainly the UK government has put in about 1.3 billion, I think it is, into vaccine production. A lot of it in-house, right? So in-house, so to speak, in Scotland. So I don't, I think getting access to the vaccine from a UK perspective is kind of a first world problem, isn't it? We have refrigeration, we have the infrastructure. What really worries me is that, almost half the population doesn't have access to that same level of infrastructure by land, let alone by refrigeration. And a lot of this stuff has to be flown in.
I think I might link that to something Andrew and Roberto and Sarath have also said, which is about vaccine nationalism. And I think one of the things that I know the tool has tried to work with is a number of tariff restrictions, as temporary restrictions that have come in as a result of sort of this vaccine nationalism, this COVID nationalism. Our data that's on the tool suggests 94 countries, in fact, it might even be more than that now, have introduced temporary tariff restrictions around COVID. So, Andrew, these are things that we really do genuinely have to worry about. It's something that affects the way in which international organisations work, but it also affects the way in which the supply chains move around the world, doesn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that, the risk we see with any future vaccines is that the trade distortions that governments might be tempted to introduce could make the whole PPE saga look like, some kind of minor affair. And our thinking, and to the point I made earlier, is we need to be able to place a very clear spotlight on any trade measures introduced that may affect the functioning of a future vaccine supply chain or supply chains. And we'd love to discuss how we can collaborate with you. We're funding a project which hopefully will be live, I think, if not next month, then certainly in January, to monitor trade restrictions in real time on critical parts of COVID-related supply chains. And our thinking is, if the World Trade Organization can't do this through its committee system, if other public institutions are unable or unwilling to do so, it really will fall to a coalition of the willing to actually look at what's happening in real time, and where there are frictions emerging, actually to intervene and to really shine a spotlight on those. And the same goes for the functioning of customs agencies. So we know there are trade facilitation problems in the supply, for instance, of polio vaccines in many economies. And it's likely that those issues in terms of vaccines being stuck in customs or refused entry to a country for weeks or even months in some instances will again play out when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines. So the question is, how can we make rapid interventions to adjust the functioning of certain customs agencies so we can actually get the vaccine supply chain working and get vaccines to the people who need them? But there are some big challenges. But I think to your earlier point, Rebecca, this really does require a collaborative effort amongst those who are willing, those who have the data, those who have the genuine commitment to make sure that the tools needed to contain the virus are available to everyone, everywhere.
Thank you. Roberto, do you want to come back on that? Because I think what's really interesting from my point of view, and I'm a big believer in multilateralism, hence the name of our technology, really believe that we all ought to be working together to solve this problem, and that the last few years really haven't been helpful in terms of allowing us to cope with the COVID-19 crisis effectively, because we've all become more economically nationalistic over the course of the last few years. So from an Asia perspective and from an ADB perspective, this tool is actually saying we all have to work together. Everybody around here is saying sustainability is about inclusiveness. It's about sustainability environmentally. It's about making sure that supply chains work and get to the poorest people in the world. Maybe you'd like to finish off the session with kind of the big ADB vision with where all of this is going.
Well, the big ADB vision is to solve this problem. Like, it's pretty simple, but obviously there has been multiple discussions that ADB has been having at regulators level to understand how we could, from a public sector as well as from a private sector perspective, support production and distribution of vaccine. So obviously we are taking a collaboratory approach with the different regulators and like main ministries of our countries of coverage, but at the same time we are trying to act as a conduit between, you know, producers and users of the vaccine. So in certain cases we have the production now seems to come up from Western world, and we need to find out the way with the local authorities how to get the distribution done. But the other way around, we're trying to see whether there is any elements of the supply chain that actually comes from our developing member countries and needs to be brought to the developed countries as components, raw material that are required for the final product. So indeed, we are trying to work both ways to leverage this. And the tool is one of the elements that shows the ADB commitment toward trying to find the solution of this tragic problem, to be fair. And so, yeah. I guess that would be our point of view from an ADB perspective.
Fantastic, thank you very much indeed. We're almost out of time, but I guess there's one final thing, and I would ask Gwynne, then Sarath to comment on this, and I think Andrew and Roberto already have, which is we're not talking about globalization anymore. The whole COVID has changed everything. The last 4 years of geopolitics have changed everything. We're not really talking about globalization anymore. 1 minute on multilateralism and how it can move the world forward in a sustainable way. Gwynne, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think, you know, there was an interesting point raised earlier, and it was about, you know, just in time. And I think it makes me think that, you know, we've been talking a lot about reshoring or nearshoring of production, and reducing risk has been a big topic, building proximity into the supply chain model to reduce dependencies on, you know, distant markets. But I think ADB has taken that concern off the table. You know, they have created a tool with you to show, you know, global suppliers to enable the right location for the right production, to get that surety of input material or finished goods, the right transport options for a more resilient solution. And yes, to your, you know, the second half of your question, the multilateral cooperation required, you know, I think, you know, I couldn't underscore it in bold any more than I already have, but this is, you know, absolutely something that's going to require not only a global effort, but just a cross-industry effort with the regulators and government entities, the banks, the clients themselves, to get this right. And, you know, I can't wait for the first ESG lens on top of this ADB product. And I'll leave it at that, because that's really the beginning of the game changer.
Thank you. Sarath, last word to you.
I don't want to speak about multilateralism in 1 minute. It'll be very difficult to do that. But what I would say is, I wish I could say that, I mean, there is an immediate change into multilateralism that's going to happen post-COVID. But definitely what we will see is increased, or at least hopefully see, is significantly increased collaborative efforts and cooperation across different institutions, some of which also need to step up the way they have managed themselves so far. And if we can see that, I think we will probably, I mean, I want to end this on a very optimistic note that we'll probably see a much more sustainable way of doing things.
Everybody, thank you so much. I hope the audience has enjoyed that. It's been fantastic just to listen to everybody sharing their thoughts and their feelings actually about how we move forward. Roberto, Sarath, Andrew, and Gwynne, thank you hugely for your time today. I know I found it extremely valuable, and we can't clap virtually, although I guess we could if we all took our mics off. But thank you very, very, very much indeed. Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye bye. Take care.
Bye.